This presentation deals with market failure. Market failure occurs when we perceive that there's a problem with the market, specifically when markets don't produce the optimal level of output from society's point of view. So the people who normally engage in an economic transaction benefit from that transaction, but sometimes there are third parties who could maybe also benefit or who may be harmed by the activity. There are a number of different kinds of market failures. The one we're going to spend most of our time with is something called an externality. But monopoly is a market failure because when monopolies dominate markets, the amount of output that society would prefer is below what actually happens. So relative to a competitive market, monopolies produce less than society would deem to be optimal. We're not going to spend a lot of time with monopoly here because we've talked about it in other places. Another kind of market failure is something called the commons problem, and that elicits another problem called the free rider problem. And then we also have the concept of public goods, and when public goods are provided, it reflects that there's a market failure. We'll talk about externalities, the commons problem, and public goods over the next few minutes. Before we go on to talk about the different kinds of market failure, I want to present the three big ways that governments address market failures themselves. The first is through antitrust. This happens primarily when there's a monopoly, and specifically when there's a monopoly that's unregulated as to prices and profits. If the industry is already regulated, we don't worry too much about antitrust laws. It's only when those industries are already unregulated that antitrust laws might be used. A second way of addressing market failure is through good old-fashioned regulation, where we limit the abilities of firms to produce because we set rules and create boundaries or limitations on their ability to produce. In some cases, we'll go the opposite direction and try to encourage more production, depending upon whether society deems there's too much of something or too little of something. And then finally, we could go kind of nuclear, take a nuclear option, and that would be if governments would simply take over businesses and become the owners of those businesses. We don't see that too much in the West, but we certainly see it in other parts of the world. So how do we correct market failure? Well, it depends on the market failure we're talking about. When we deal with market failure, we're facing a situation where markets don't produce the optimal level of output from society's point of view. So in the case of the picture here, it might be that we have too much Kardashian in the world, that it's an overproduction of something. It's not optimal from society's point of view. And as we look at these market failures, that's really the focus, is whether or not there is something going on that causes there to be too much or too little of something produced from society's perspective. One of the kind of externalities that we face, and the one we probably would be most familiar with, would be negative externalities. Typically, we use the example of pollution as a negative externality, where there's some economic activity that's happening and it's creating pollution, and somebody who's outside of the scope of the activity is being harmed by that activity. So perhaps you live downstream from a factory, they pollute the water, and then you can't go fishing or swimming in the river because of the pollution. That would be a negative externality. Or maybe there's somebody who lives next to you and starts having a party at 2 a.m. and it causes a lot of pollution in terms of noise and maybe light, and it keeps you from being able to get a good night's sleep. That would be a kind of negative externality. In the world of software, we oftentimes see externalities, at least the potential of externalities, in the world of software development. So if you have bad software development, somebody buys the software and gains from having that software. The people who produce the software gain from the exchange as well. But then there are negative externalities because the software is buggy and it allows hackers into the software, and somebody who inadvertently uses a website that's based upon that software is harmed, as a result of the poor construction. So we end up bearing the burden of the shoddy coating because the costs of updating and patching are borne by us rather than the developer themselves. When we look at a negative externality from a graphical representation, here's what we end up seeing. We have a demand curve, the demand curve right here, this blue line sloping downward, and then we have initially this red supply curve, this one that's labeled S internal. That focuses our attention on who's bearing the costs of production. In this case, the costs are borne by the firm, just like a normal production process. Where those two lines cross, we have this kind of red dot, and we drop down and we find a QM, and then we go across and find PM. This is the market equilibrium price and quantity that would normally occur as a result of this economic activity. But if we take into account the costs from this activity that are put upon society as a whole, society would prefer there to actually be less supply. So that's what we have up here, this S social. That's the social optimum in terms of supply. That's the blue line, the blue supply curve here. And where those two lines cross, the two blue lines, the social supply and the demand curve, we have a blue dot there. And that, if we drop down from that blue dot to the quantity axis, we would have Q soc. And if we go across to the price axis, we would have P soc. Those are the prices and quantities that society would prefer because they don't want as much production as is currently happening. That leaves us with this kind of orange triangle, which is a dead weight loss from overproduction. So in this case, we have too much production and it causes a dead weight loss. So what we see here with the negative externality is that there are two supply curves, one for the private production, one for social production, and we see a dead weight loss that results because we've overproduced relative to what society would prefer. Now in the case of a positive externality, we have a little bit of a different story here. Positive externalities are externalities that exist when the benefit of producing something isn't captured fully by the producer. And as a result, they don't produce as much as society would like. A lot of times we can use the example of inoculations or vaccinations against disease as an example of a positive externality. It's good if people get vaccinated because it prevents this sort of herd spreading of disease amongst the population. Not everybody needs to be vaccinated, but a majority of people need to be to prevent the spread of disease. And so what we see in the case of vaccinations is something that might appear in this graph. Here we have the internal benefits, essentially, the demand on the internal side and the demand that society actually has. If we look just at the internal demand and see where that line crosses the supply curve, we would end up with QM and PM over here. But society would like there to be more vaccinations, and basically society would be willing to pay for those vaccinations, pay at the P social price, in order to get Q social in terms of the quantity. So the market equilibrium is the red dot, but the social optimum occurs at the blue dot. Now, in order to get to that social quantity, what we might do is we might subsidize vaccinations. We might say in poorer areas, we'll just give them out for free. Governments can step in and fund those kinds of things. And so what we see here is that there's a deadweight loss, but only if you underproduce. So if you produce at QM, you have this orange triangle representing value to society that would have been created had we been producing at the social optimal. In the case of the negative externality, we want to discourage that behavior. And so what we might do is tax that behavior or increase the regulations on those industries. But in the case of a positive externality, we want to encourage that activity, so we might end up subsidizing it. In InfoSec, we do see externalities. Many of them are on the positive side. Microsoft tends to focus on the positive externalities of work skills. And what that means is it may not be as flashy and as hip as Apple, but the ability to run Microsoft and the Microsoft tools, whether it's Excel or Word or PowerPoint or whatever the case may be, is something that's very valuable. It's valuable for businesses. It's a skill that's important to have as a consumer, and as your ability to use those kinds of software increase, there are positive externalities for businesses, for potential employers. And so Microsoft focuses on that side, whereas Apple tends to focus on the positive externalities of sharing information, where the more information we share, whether it's through our iPhone or whether it's through our iPad or our Mac or whatever, the more benefits are projected onto society at large. So those are the externalities. Like I said, we're going to skip over monopoly just because we talk about monopoly a lot in other areas. And we're going to move on to this idea of the commons problem and free riders. Now, the reason we have a little picture of a sheep here is because the traditional sort of story of a commons problem occurs where you've got shepherds or people who are grazing livestock, and they come to an area that's not really owned. There are no clear definitions as to who owns a particular piece of land. And so when herds are brought to graze on that land, it gets overused, it gets essentially decimated, and then people move on. But the problem is that because it's commonly owned land, there are no private property rights, and there's no incentive to use that property wisely. This can lead to a free rider problem because those shepherds who bring their flocks, those herds, to the commons area don't bear the burden of the destruction of that land, and they essentially they end up free riding off of the property-less land. As far as information security and just sort of the information world we live in, one of the questions that comes up in terms of this commons problem is whether or not the internet is a commons. There's no clear owner, and there's certainly no clear control over the internet. And it might help us to understand the behavior of hackers if we understand that there's no private ownership of the information superhighway. Now, websites there are some ownership issues there. I asked this question: does the prevalence of hacking make the web like the ocean? We talk about the ocean as being common property because nobody owns it. Unfortunately, that means that people overuse it. Similar to the grazing example, people overfish the oceans because if you don't get the fish out of the ocean, somebody else will come along and take it. And there's no governing body to say, hey, the oceans need to be protected and we can't have people overfishing it. If hackers are like those fishermen who overfish the ocean, and if indeed the internet is a commons problem, or at least if you answer the question, is the internet a commons, if you answered it in the affirmative, then that might open the door for internet regulation of government regulation over the internet, and that would change the way the internet looks. The last market failure that I want to talk about is the idea of a public good. A public good is a good that's a little bit different than a commons, although there are some similarities. A commons or a public good is a good where there is a desire for the good, but private sector firms have difficulty, and it may even be impossible. They have difficulty in making money by providing the public good because of two characteristics of a public good. One characteristic is that the good is what we call non-excludable. It means that you can't keep people from using it even if they don't pay. For example, a fireworks show. A fireworks show would be a good that's non-excludable. You can't keep people from watching the fireworks even if they don't pay for admission. In fact, usually there isn't an admission fee to see a fireworks show. The other characteristic is that the good is non-rival in consumption. And what that means is that if you use the good, and I use the good, and your cousin Joe uses the good, it doesn't diminish any of our enjoyment of the good if somebody else uses it. So, public radio, for example, is a good that's non-rival in consumption. I can listen to it, you can listen to it, the whole world can listen to it, and it doesn't limit our enjoyment of the good. In fact, it might increase our enjoyment of the good, because then we can talk about what we heard on public radio. I'm going to go back to our picture here. This is a picture of PNC Park in Pittsburgh, and it was built by government money, and it's a good that is owned by the city of Pittsburgh, but it doesn't fit the definition of a public good, because this is one of those places where it's really hard to get into without paying. And sometimes if there's too many people in the stadium, it can reduce your enjoyment of the game. It could increase your enjoyment of the game, but sometimes the people sitting behind you are louts. They're lousy and they curse and they're throwing beer around, and it may not be as enjoyable. So this is what we call a quasi-public good, a good that's provided by government, but it doesn't fit the definitions of a public good, a pure public good, which have to be non-rival in consumption and non-excludable. So sometimes we ask whether or not the internet is a public good. Is it a good that's out there that people really, really want? I think the answer is yes. Is it excludable? Can we keep people from using it? I guess we can, but it's really hard to do that because there's so many access points. Is it non-rival in consumption? Well, I mean, if you think about the information superhighway as a highway, that's a good that's provided for by government. But if you have a lot of people using it, it can certainly slow you down. So the internet may not be a public good in the perfect sense of that word. Nevertheless, people talk about regulating public goods or the provision of public goods and making sure government provides things that people want, and maybe the government gets involved in the provision of access to the internet. Software is another issue that comes up when we talk about market failure. Does badly designed software indicate the government should regulate this market? If there is very little incentive to provide a quality software product, or if there are too many firms engaging in vaporware so that they can try to keep their customer base locked in, is that something that government should step in and try to fix? Is Microsoft a public good? Most people would say no, but there are some people who would say yes, it is. It's something that generates positive externalities, and as a result of this, perhaps we should regulate that, or certainly the internet. Should we treat the internet like a public utility, where there isn't enough internet access, and so we want more of that? We either subsidize the activity, or government simply takes over and establishes the infrastructure and allows access to the infrastructure. It's an interesting question, and it's something that we can kind of think about in the context of whether or not we view this as a public good, whether there's some other market failure surrounding not only software but also access to the internet. Another question that comes up is whether or not failure to protect someone's data is a market failure. Is the sort of excess hacking that goes on an indication that there's just a fundamental flaw in the whole information world that would best be protected by government? There's a court case, FTC versus Wyndham, that basically said that Wyndham promised to protect people's information. They did a very bad job of it. FTC sued them for false practices, basically making a claim that they didn't live up to. But this raises more questions. Will the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, come after companies who fail to protect customer data in the using the idea that this is a market failure, that we don't have enough data protection? And in order for there to be more of it, we need government involvement in these markets. In the Wyndham case, the courts say that the firms have promised to do this, but they're just not living up to their promises. So does this alter the incentives to promise security? Maybe firms will just stop promising that they're going to take care of data, and that might eliminate any legal problems for the firm. And then I think a really important question is whether or not this alters the optimal amount of security. Will firms over-secure? Will they under-secure, hoping not to get sued by the FTC? Those are kinds of things that come up when governments start to engage, sort of insert themselves into markets. And that brings up our final point. And that is that when governments step in to fix a problem, sometimes they make it worse. And that's what's called a government failure. This happens when governments install price controls over things. So if you put a minimum wage in place, you create a gap between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied of labor, and a minimum wage, if set properly above the equilibrium wage, will actually create unemployment. And that's not the intention, but that's what ends up happening. If they have quantity limits, they can end up creating black markets. What if they force you to be involved in a market, like the healthcare market? Is that optimal? Some people say yes, some people say no, but it's certainly going to change behavior. And those are the kinds of things economists pay attention to, is when you start to regulate worlds, whenever there are market failures, perhaps the result, the conclusion is that government's answers to the problem leave us worse off than they would have if they'd just left things alone.